For all of you extremely frustrated renters out there in New York City, this video's for you. Do you want to know why the rental market is still frustrating the heck out of you? Even though many are saying the market peaked in 2022 and prices are settling a bit, I know you're still pulling your hair out trying to find suitable inventory without breaking the bank. You want to know why? Believe it or not, to get the answer to this question, we have to go back a couple of years because it has to do with the COVID exodus and the sitting inventory in the fourth quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021. This is what's forcing renters to feel frustrated by the urgency to move quickly and the lack of options available for the last few months, last several months, and many months to come. So, allow me to explain how we got here using my children's math blocks. So let's pretend we're looking at the New York rental market pre-pandemic, and imagine each of these stacks of blocks represents a month of the year, and each of the individual blocks represents an available apartment for rent. As you can see by the varied number of blocks in each stack, even before the pandemic, the rental market was subject to some seasonality. There was a natural higher turnover of leases during the late spring, April, May, into the summer, June, July, August, and into the early fall, September, October. This is because this corresponding demand for apartments in those months is higher. And since leases typically run on a 12-month cycle, if there's a higher demand for apartments in those months, more availability will naturally occur to meet that demand. Of course, there's availability in every month of the year, January, February, November, December, and there are certainly renters who need apartments to rent and leases to start in December, January, February. There are fewer apartments available in those months, as you can see here, but demand is lower as well. In fact, before the pandemic, many renters preferred looking for apartments in the off-season because they found prices were lower, there was less competition, and oftentimes the incentives were more prevalent, such as a month free, 2 months free, no fee. Well, as I'm sure you remember, in March 2020, the real estate market completely shut down, as did every other market, due to the COVID pandemic. And it didn't reopen until early July of 2020. As you may remember, what happened in the few months between March and July was something of an exodus from the city. Many people left temporarily to move in with family or rent an Airbnb, while others left for good. In either case, many renters walked away from their leases or were allowed to terminate their lease early due to hardship with their landlord. Vacancies increased between March 2020 and July 2020 without the ability for the landlord to show or re-rent those apartments at all. In July, once the rental market reopened, we were still in the midst of the pandemic and the exodus continued. For the rest of 2020 and into the early part of 2021, vacancies rose dramatically in New York City, despite landlords offering ridiculous incentives or reduced rents to those willing to sign a lease. Then things changed, and they changed quickly. As companies began planning for a return to the office in the summer of 2021, these thousands and thousands of empty apartments were absorbed in April, May, June, and July of 2021. Incentives dwindled and prices began to rise as the pool of returning renters and New Yorkers grew and grew. Remember that? But, you ask, Eirik, how does that explain why I can't find an apartment in February of 2023? Well, I'm glad you asked. So let's pick up in the late fall, early winter of 2020 to see what happened to the off-market inventory, since that's what's causing a lot of the heartache in February of 2023, January of 2023, December 2022, and unfortunately, it's going to continue on from here for some time. October of 2020. In October 2020, we were still struggling. In my inventories in 2 buildings in Gramercy, 300 units, I had inventory stacking up and I wasn't able to rent it. So what happened is my October availability that didn't rent then got stacked onto my November availability. So now all of the new apartments that are either becoming naturally vacant or apartments where tenants left their lease early Now all of a sudden I've got more vacancy in November than I would typically have because I'm not renting anything. All of that vacancy, considering I don't rent any of those apartments in November, then goes on to the December timeline, right? So now all of those vacancies are now available in December. I've got a lot of inventory to get rid of, but it doesn't end there. In January of 2021, right over here, we are still struggling. We're still struggling to rent apartments, and so all of my December availability in 2020 gets stacked onto my availability for January of 2021. And it continues. All of my availability carries over. I might rent 1 or 2 apartments in those months, but for the most part, my inventory is growing and I don't have enough of a pool of renters to absorb that inventory. The same thing happens in March. So now my stack is toppling over. It's exactly how it felt, actually, in March of 2021. But I've got all of this inventory in March of 2021. And then something magical happens. Well, at least magical for the landlords. All of a sudden, the market changed. And renters who knew they were coming back to New York City, who were sick of staying with their parents, or their parents were sick of them living at home, or their Airbnb had run out, or they just realized that they had to get back early, otherwise they were going to be in that middle of that summer rush trying to get back into an apartment. All of a sudden, people started coming back to rent. And in March, a little bit in March, but mostly in April, all of a sudden, apartments started to get rented again. So now, all of a sudden, all of this vacancy that has been piling up for months and months and months starts to get absorbed. By July, I've absorbed all of my rental inventory. But now look at what's happened to the distribution of apartments over the year. Because all of these apartments sat in October, November, December, and in January, February, March, all of that inventory is now on a 12-month cycle in the summer months, leaving a dearth of inventory in the off-season. But it doesn't end there. There's one more factor complicating inventory in the off-season months of the year, and that's that many landlords offered incentives in the form of free rent at that time. And in many cases, these 3 months of rent are added to the traditional 12-month lease, extending the lease to a 13, 14, or 15-month lease. For instance, if you rented an apartment in April of 2020, the landlord may have offered you a 3-month free rent incentive on a 15-month lease. So you paid for 12 months of rent, but received 3 months of free rent for signing that lease at that time, lowering your what we call net effective rent. And that's where a lot of the great deals came, right? So in the case that I just mentioned, 3 months free in April, that lease term would now last until the end of July. These types of incentives were very common in the spring and early summer months of 2021 until the inventory was absorbed. So even apartments naturally coming available in April and May, in many cases, are now on a June, July, August, September availability cycle. Now, many of you are saying, well, I would expect landlords to correct this by offering longer lease terms now to kind of resettle the distribution and get back to some sort of normal. But unfortunately for renters, the reality is that landlords often prefer their apartments to come available in the late spring to early fall months because of that higher demand. There's less chance that they have to offer incentives or price breaks. There's less time on the market. And as many of you know, they can charge higher rents. So to those of you who like to search for an apartment in January, February, March, December, you may find yourself in a more difficult position, not only right now, but for the years to come. So now you're asking, what's the solution? Because there are many solutions. We often talk about price, size, location, amenities, and time. And if you want to know more about that, call us and we'll talk you through it. We'll help you succeed in this market or in any market.